When Jack Harris unexpectedly became the heir to a billionaire's fortune, he had no idea it would lead him to dark secrets tied to racism and family betrayals. Every choice he made would change the fate of many, and the truth about the past would turn his life upside down. What he does next will surprise even the most seasoned. But let's start at the beginning. Gregory Wilson wasn't just a billionaire. He was one of the most influential men in the country, leading a major corporation involved in investments and real estate. His name was always synonymous with money, power, and influence, and despite his age, no one expected him to pass away so soon. The circumstances of his death were shrouded in mystery, leading to numerous rumors, from a heart attack to possible poisoning. Some speculated that his health had been in decline for years, but he kept it hidden from the public. His family, his son James and daughter Emily, knew that sooner or later they would have to deal with the distribution of his wealth, but they were certain it would stay within the family. James, as the eldest son, always assumed he would inherit not only a large portion of the money, but also control over the family business. He had been trained from childhood in all aspects of running the corporation, and had enjoyed the privileges of wealth from a young age. Emily, on the other hand, distanced herself from her father's affairs, focusing on art and philanthropy, though she still expected a substantial share of the inheritance. Their mother, Marianne, though divorced from Gregory, still anticipated a large portion as compensation for the years spent with him. When the time came to read the will, the atmosphere in the room was tense. There was a mix of anticipation and certainty in the air. Everyone believed the money would remain within the family, and no one expected any surprises. The family's lawyer, the silver-haired Mr. Hayes, laid out the documents before him and began reading. Everything was proceeding as usual until he reached the key point regarding the distribution of the estate. Instead of the expected sums going to the children and ex-wife, an unfamiliar name rang out: Jack Harris. This moment was like a bolt from the blue. Everyone present, especially James, froze in shock. 90% of the entire estate, including company shares, real estate, and capital totaling around $500 million, was going to a man named Jack Harris. The name meant nothing to anyone in the room, and no one had ever heard of him. James jumped to his feet, outraged by his father's decision, and demanded an explanation. "This is a mistake. This man has no connection to our family," he exclaimed. But the will was clear and unambiguous. Jack Harris was indeed the main heir. The Wilson family, accustomed to luxury and power, was crushed by this turn of events. James, who had always assumed he would inherit the family business, began seriously questioning what led his father to make such a shocking decision. Emily sat in stunned silence, unable to believe her ears. Marianne, though trying to maintain her composure, couldn't hide her shock and anger. Meanwhile, Jack Harris, a simple and humble man, far removed from the world of millionaires and luxury, had no idea that his life had just changed overnight. He had never been part of the elite, never attended high society events, and had lived a modest life, barely making ends meet. When he was informed that he had inherited one of the largest fortunes in the country, he was stunned. To him, it was not just a stroke of luck, but an enormous responsibility he didn't yet know how to handle. The Wilson family was furious, especially James, who had been used to wealth from childhood and always knew he would run the family business. But now, this stranger, Jack Harris, a man with no ties to their family, owned everything James had always considered rightfully his. Jack Harris couldn't come to terms with the sudden change in his life. Yesterday, he was an ordinary worker, a man who struggled daily to support himself, and now he found himself in the spotlight as a newly minted billionaire. However, instead of the euphoria one might expect from such a situation, Jack was consumed by anxiety. This newfound wealth brought him no joy or peace. It brought a torrent of problems he had never faced before. It all started with the journalists. They swarmed his home, desperate for an interview with the mysterious heir. Reporters dug into his past, searching for any information: who he was, why Gregory Wilson chose him, and how this ordinary man ended up with a multi-million-dollar fortune. They unearthed people from his past, looking for any sensational details. But Jack was an outsider to this world. He had never had any connections to the elite, and his acquaintances had nothing scandalous to offer. Yet the media's hunger for a story was insatiable. Meanwhile, the Wilson family couldn't come to terms with the loss of the fortune, especially James. For him, this was more than a blow to his pride. It was the collapse of his entire life. He had been certain he would inherit the money and continue his father's legacy. Now, with everything gone to this stranger, James decided to take action. He was convinced there had to be a hidden motive, some connection between his father and Jack Harris. If he could uncover it, he could challenge the will. James began his investigation in the archives. He hired private detectives to dig into Jack's past, starting with his childhood. They sifted through documents and photos, trying to find any link between Jack and Gregory Wilson. But on the surface, there was nothing. No direct contact, no history that could justify such a generous inheritance. It seemed as though Jack had simply appeared out of nowhere. At the same time, Jack was trying to make sense of the situation himself. He had always lived a quiet life, without grand ambitions, accepting his fate as it was. His mother, who had passed away several years earlier, was the only person who ever spoke to him about his father. She had always called him a special man, but never revealed his name. Jack grew up not knowing his father and never dwelled on it. He simply accepted the fact that his mother was the only parent he had ever known. But now, after everything that had happened, Jack began to reconsider her words. Perhaps she had known more than she let on. Perhaps Gregory Wilson was the man she had spoken of. But if so, why had he left Jack in poverty if he was so wealthy? And why, after all these years, had he chosen to leave him his fortune? These questions haunted Jack. Unlike the Wilson family, he didn't have the resources for a thorough investigation, but he began recalling every detail, every phrase his mother had ever said about his origins. Despite all his attempts to find answers, Jack couldn't shake one persistent feeling. He didn't deserve this wealth. He had never done anything to justify receiving such a vast fortune. Thoughts swirled in his mind, convincing him that this was all a mistake, that he didn't belong among billionaires. In the end, he was just an ordinary man, living his life without aspirations for grand riches. Now, he found himself at the center of a financial scandal, and while he didn't want the money, the people around him were consumed by intrigue and passion. James Wilson was a man used to getting what he wanted at any cost. After the shocking revelation of his father's will, in which the majority of the fortune went to a complete stranger, James was consumed by fury. He couldn't accept that his own father had not only denied him the money, but also stripped him of his rightful place as the heir to the family corporation. More than that, it threatened his entire identity, as he had always seen himself as the rightful successor to the Wilson family legacy. The only thing keeping him from despair was the belief that there had to be a reason, a hidden connection between his father and this Jack Harris, and James was willing to go to any lengths to uncover it. James practically lived in his office, surrounded by old papers, letters, and documents that once belonged to his father. Among these, he stumbled upon a box of letters sent to his father in the late 1970s, when Gregory Wilson's business was just starting to take off. The letters were an unexpected discovery, as James had no idea they even existed. They were from a woman named Ellen Moore, and at first glance, they appeared to be typical love letters, full of passion and promises. But the more James read, the clearer it became that his father's relationship with this woman was far more significant. Ellen was a woman from a poor neighborhood with whom Gregory had been involved during the early days of his career. In one of the letters, she revealed that she was pregnant and begged Gregory to come back to her, promising not to interfere with his success if he would at least support her financially. The letters, filled with desperation and hope, showed how she fought for their future. But Gregory, focused on his career and ambitions, chose to leave her and return to his family, committing himself fully to building the Wilson empire. The most shocking moment came when James found a letter in which his father confessed to an old friend that he had a son born out of wedlock to Ellen, but he had chosen to hide this fact to protect his family and reputation. That son was Jack Harris, who had no idea of his true lineage. Gregory, burdened by guilt, realized he could never completely atone for his mistake. But in the final years of his life, tortured by his conscience, he decided to leave his fortune to his illegitimate son, Jack, as a way of making amends. Reading these letters was a cold, harsh awakening for James. He couldn't believe he had a half-brother he never knew about. The revelation didn't just shock him, it shattered his entire worldview. Jack Harris, the poor laborer whom James had dismissed as unworthy, was his blood relative. This fact struck James like a dagger, but the situation grew even more complicated when he realized the consequences of uncovering the truth. If it became public that Gregory had an illegitimate son, it would ruin his reputation, and with it, the Wilson business. James knew that his own status as the family's rightful heir would be at risk. The company he had long considered his could lose the trust of investors and partners if these family secrets were revealed. Society doesn't easily forgive such scandals, especially when large sums of money and family values are at stake. James was torn by inner conflict. He was prepared to fight for his inheritance to the bitter end, but knew that exposing the truth could be catastrophic for both him and the company. He was faced with a moral dilemma: keep everything secret and try to find other ways to regain control, or risk everything by revealing the truth about his half-brother. This moral struggle ate away at him, adding to his growing hatred for Jack Harris, who remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around his name. Meanwhile, Jack continued to live his modest life, unaware of the chaos surrounding him. When Jack Harris learned the truth about his parentage, his world was turned upside down once again. He was shocked to discover that Gregory Wilson, the billionaire whose fortune he had inherited, was his father. This revelation hit him just as hard as the news of the inheritance itself. Jack, who had grown up without a father, never imagined that his roots held such a secret. However, instead of feeling joy or relief at the unveiling of this family truth, he was consumed by a deep inner struggle. His entire life now felt like a lie, and the fortune he had received seemed to symbolize that injustice. Jack had always lived honestly and humbly. He had taken pride in the fact that he earned his living through hard work, even if it was at the lowest-paying jobs. But now, he found himself in a position where he had to reevaluate his relationship with wealth and fortune. He didn't feel he deserved this money. He hadn't been part of Gregory's life, had no relationship with him, and had never known the truth about his heritage. Deep down, he wanted to return the money to the Wilson family, convinced that they deserved it more than he did. Yet, he also understood that simply giving the money back wouldn't solve everything. His moral dilemma was that while he couldn't legally refuse the inheritance, he also couldn't live with the idea that it belonged to him by right. Jack realized that returning the fortune to the Wilson family wouldn't necessarily help them, as it could only fuel their greed and internal conflicts. Money had already torn their relationships apart, turning them into prisoners of their own ambitions and resentments. He could see that these people were broken, burdened by their expectations, and wasn't sure that money would heal their lives. In fact, it might only worsen the deep-seated issues within the family. James, meanwhile, wrestled with his own moral dilemma. His rage toward Jack began to fade, replaced by deep frustration. All his life he had believed that money and power would fill the void within him. But now, when that goal was out of reach, he started to realize that wealth wouldn't fix his internal problems. The loss of the inheritance made him confront the emptiness in his life that had existed even when his future wealth seemed guaranteed. It became clear that money was not the solution to all his problems, and he began to question what he truly needed to find happiness. Yet his pride wouldn't allow him to accept this publicly, and he continued to cling to the remnants of his influence. Over the following weeks, tense and complicated discussions took place between Jack and the Wilson family. Jack wanted to relinquish the inheritance, but he didn't know how to do so in a way that felt right. James, though trying to maintain his composure, knew that simply taking the money back wouldn't solve his deeper issues. These debates led nowhere until Jack finally decided to take a different approach. He announced that he would donate the majority of the fortune to charity. This decision was driven by his belief that wealth should serve a greater purpose, not selfish desires, and should be used to help those truly in need. In interviews with reporters, he explained that he didn't feel entitled to the money and that it was more important for him to assist people who had faced even more difficult circumstances than his own. Jack was firm and sincere when he spoke about how his own life had taught him to value simple joys and the necessity of helping those struggling to survive. The public was stunned by this decision. A charitable gesture of this scale from someone who had been virtually unknown in the world of billionaires just days before caused a media frenzy. Headlines hailed Jack as a hero, a billionaire who had turned down wealth to help the poor. Journalists constantly sought to learn how Jack planned to allocate the money and who would benefit from his generosity. But for Jack, this wasn't a publicity stunt. He felt he had finally found his purpose in this new world. The decision to donate the fortune brought him a sense of inner peace. Though he still struggled with his past, he knew he was making the right choice. Now, the money that had once torn people apart could be used to save lives. This resolution marked the culmination of his moral struggle and changed not only his life, but the lives of many people around him. The Wilson family, however, was stunned by Jack's decision. James couldn't comprehend how Jack could walk away from such a fortune. His own understanding of wealth and power had been shattered before his very eyes. He realized that money was never Jack's goal, as it had been for him. Now, James faced the truth, that his relationships with his father, mother, and sister had been destroyed not by the loss of money, but by the deep internal conflicts that money only amplified. When Jack Harris decided to donate the majority of Gregory Wilson's fortune to charity, it created a media storm. Headlines celebrated the billionaire who gave it all away for the greater good. This act of generosity, seemingly unheard of in a world where wealth and power are so often intertwined with selfishness and greed, turned Jack into a symbol of moral strength and altruism. The charity fund, established with Gregory's fortune, quickly grew into one of the largest humanitarian efforts in the country. In the first few months after the fund's creation, hundreds of families in impoverished areas received support, including assistance for the underprivileged, funding for educational programs, and the construction of homes for the homeless. Jack personally attended many of these events, not seeking to avoid the media's attention, but also not aiming for fame. His primary goal remained the same: to do what he felt was right. The money, which could have been the cause of his moral downfall, was now being used to save lives. He felt he was honoring his father's memory by righting the wrongs of the past. The fund quickly became one of the most respected charitable organizations in the country, and its name was soon mentioned alongside the largest global foundations. Journalists couldn't stop writing about how a humble worker had become a billionaire and managed to turn his fortune into a powerful force for good. This brought Jack not only respect, but public recognition. People saw him as someone who hadn't succumbed to the temptations of great wealth, but had instead used it to make the world a better place. For Jack, however, this recognition wasn't important. He was searching for peace, and he had found it. With each new project, with every family helped, he felt he was finding the purpose that had been missing from his life. No longer was he just a worker scraping by. He was now someone who helped others escape the poverty he had once known. And that brought him true fulfillment. Meanwhile, the Wilson family was undergoing its own transformation. James, who had spent his entire life believing that money solved everything, was forced to reevaluate his priorities. At first, he couldn't accept that the majority of the fortune had gone to charity instead of to him. But as he watched the fund grow and saw how his half-brother was turning that money into real good, James began to realize that wealth, in and of itself, didn't bring happiness. He saw how thousands of people were grateful to Jack for his help and how their lives were changing because of that money, and he understood that he would never have achieved such an impact if he had inherited the fortune. James came to the conclusion that his rage and desire for revenge weren't truly about losing the money, but stemmed from the deeper internal issues that wealth couldn't fix. He realized that his real problems had always been tied to his need to prove his worth through power and capital, not through meaningful action. Watching Jack change people's lives, James began to reflect on his own priorities. It took time for him to accept that he, too, could reshape his life and make it more meaningful by focusing on action rather than simply owning wealth. Over time, A fragile understanding began to grow between Jack and James. They began to communicate not as enemies, but as brothers, connected not only by blood, but by their shared history. Jack harbored no ill will toward James, understanding how hard it was to lose something that seemed rightfully yours. James, on the other hand, realized that his life hadn't fallen apart because of a lack of money. He could rebuild his future if he let go of his old grudges. Their reconciliation became the true culmination of the story. In the end, Jack and James found a way to leave behind their bitterness, anger, and thirst for revenge. Both realized that while money could divide people, only meaningful actions and genuine deeds could truly bring them together. Although James didn't receive the millions he had considered his birthright, he started looking for new meaning in his life, and his relationship with Jack grew stronger than either could have imagined at the start of this journey. The sensational story of how a billionaire left his fortune to a stranger didn't end with one person winning and another losing. Instead, it ended with two people finding a path to reconciliation and to better understanding themselves. Jack found the peace he had long sought, while James realized that true value lies not in money, but in the actions one takes for others. Jack Harris's story of charity became a lasting example that wealth isn't just about capital. It's about the opportunity to make life better. But most importantly, both brothers came to understand that their relationship, once fractured by greed and resentment, could be restored if they let go of the things that didn't really matter.